Thank you. And hopefully we will come to the point that it will be worth it.
Dobrze, drodzy Państwo, zaraz
Ladies and gentlemen, we will be
Życzymy Państwu przyjemnej podróży.
No to jeszcze raz, drodzy Państwo, dzień dobry.
So once again, ladies and gentlemen, good morning. You know that I wrote on my sheet of paper, good morning, just to make sure. I said, I'm Maja Herman. I'll introduce myself in a while. Now our main guest is Robert Whitaker, who wrote a book called The Epidemic of, about the epidemic of psychiatric diseases in America. Who is Robert Whitaker? Everybody's asking me, okay, who is going to be your guest? Who is Robert Whitaker? Well, he's primarily a journalist. Now I'll be looking at him to make sure he's correct. He's created a website, Mad in America. He's a journalist. And primarily he's the author of books, and we're going to talk about. He has been nominated to many awards, and he has been awarded for the book we're going to talk about today. He was awarded for investigative report and editor. The book was released in 2010 in the United States, and it was published in Poland just last year. And this should be remembered here. Now, what are the books about? These are scientific books about psychiatry and medicine. Now, I listened to the audiobook, and what I liked, I listened to a fragment that Robert loves a library, which he enters, and there are thousands of different tomes, volumes of the history of medicine, and that's his world, into which he delves, and he says he is surprised why so few people like to reach for such resources, why so few people look into the old books about medicine, because the truth is that nothing and nobody is a lonely island. And it doesn't really matter whether we talk about Maja Herman or Robert Whitaker or about mental health. Everybody is surrounded by other things that still lead to other things. So it's a great conglomerate of numerous islands, interconnected ones. And I'd like to have a discussion today, and I'd like you to participate. and we devoted quite a lot of time for your questions so that you can express your opinions. Now, who am I? As in Bridget Jones, you need to say 3 sentences about one person, 3 sentences about another one. I'm a psychiatrist, psychotherapist. I'm also a mad influencer. I'm a person who wants to use social media to affect your education and choices. Sorry, it's not correct. I'd like to give you an opportunity to make an informed choice by providing data about health and what's available so that you could make a choice having all the data available. All right. Now, I'd like to tell you that myself, I suffered from depression at least 2 times. The first time, I didn't treat it at all. And by treatment, I understand all kinds of possible activities or ways of treatment. And the first time, I didn't decide to go to treatment because I thought I failed, it was my fault. And it was already when I was a trained psychiatrist. Now, Robert, I'd like to move on to a second part of the interview. Now, Robert, in our country usually use sir, but I hope you don't mind being called on a first name basis. Now, I'd like to ask you what was your main motivation to write your book. Now, a lot of people say, okay, I did something with, let's say, without emotion, with a cool mind, but it's not true. All decisions are affected by emotions. Now, those emotions may be on a different scale, but my question is, what made you, what drove you, what made you take to write this book?
Well, first of all, thank you. It's a pleasure to be here, and it's an honor to be here. So thank you all for coming too. As Dr. Herman said, we were expecting maybe 5 people, so this is great to see you all here. Maja, okay, sorry. Well, it's like Sir Dr. Herman. So what was my motivation for writing this book? And really writing about the history of psychiatry. It goes back to a long time ago, 1998, and I was a newspaper journalist writing for magazines for a long time as well. I also had a period of time when I was director of publications at Harvard Medical School, and this was in the 1990s when there was a lot of talk about evidence-based medicine, that we needed evidence-based medicine because, and one of the thoughts with evidence-based medicine is doctors can be deluded about the merits of their therapies, and you have to have evidence for what you do. So I was doing a series for the Boston Globe in 1998, and it was really about research projects that really were pretty abusive of psychiatric patients. Now, at this time, I had a completely conventional understanding of psychiatry and its place. And my understanding at that time was that we were making great progress in understanding the biology of mental disorders. And so, for example, that we had discovered, when we, I say researchers had discovered that depression was due to too little serotonin, and that we now had antidepressants that fixed that chemical imbalance, like, and what researchers would say when I called them up, like insulin for diabetes. And if that's true, that's a story of a great medical advance. Either you've identified the molecule that causes depression, or with schizophrenia and psychotic disorders, the story was that these were due to too much dopamine in the brain. We had antipsychotics that, by virtue of blocking dopamine, brought that back up into balance. So that's a story of great progress. And by the way, in the 1990s, we got a second generation of antipsychotic drugs known as the atypical antipsychotics, and this was seen also as this story of progress. However, while I was doing that research, I came upon two types of studies that belied that story of progress. One was a study done by Harvard researchers, published in 1994, which looked at long-term recovery rates for schizophrenia patients in basically the Western world, the US and Western Europe. And they said rather than improve, outcomes today were no better than they had been in the first third of the 20th century, and they had actually declined since the 1970s. So that belied this story of progress. And then there was studies done, cross-cultural studies, done by the World Health Organization, which compared schizophrenia outcomes in 3 developing countries, India, Colombia, and Nigeria, with outcomes in the US and 6 other developed countries. And both times they found that outcomes were much better in the developing countries, specifically India and Nigeria. And these were schizophrenia patients diagnosed by Western doctors and by Western standards. Now, this was quite surprising to me. They even concluded in one of those studies that living in a developed country is a strong predictor that if you're diagnosed with schizophrenia, you won't have a good outcome. Now, after the first such study, which was 5 years in length, they did a second study, the World Health Organization, because this surprised the investigators. And one of their hypotheses with the when they did the second one, one of the hypotheses for the reason for the better outcomes in the developing countries was that the patients were more medication compliant. They took their antipsychotics regularly, whereas patients in Western countries may have been more rebellious against that. Now, that's a valid hypothesis, because if medications are supposed to be so essential to good long-term outcomes, if medication is supposed to be so essential, then compliance should lead to better outcomes. However, what they found was that the best outcomes were, in fact, where the drugs were used acutely, but not chronically. So, for example, in India, they used them just to knock down the psychotic episode, but they did not maintain people on the medications. So this completely contradicted in the United States and elsewhere that antipsychotics were absolutely essential for people so diagnosed and for the long term. So that led me to get a contract to write a book called Mad in America, and it turned into a historical account of how we think about people who are seen as mad and how we treated them over the 200 years, but also meant to investigate this failure in Western medicine. Why should living in a developed country be a strong predictor that you won't have a good outcome? And what you find in that history is really a counter-narrative to the popular narrative that it supports regular use of the antipsychotics. And then I can jump ahead to Anatomy of an Epidemic. So I published that book. It was controversial because anytime you go against conventional wisdom, especially medical wisdom, you're going to end up in controversy. However, that book, just to sort of defend myself, it was eventually picked by as one of the best science books of 2002. After that, this is a long-winded answer, but basically my agent said, do not write about psychiatry again. You'll ruin your career as a writer. So I wrote a couple of other books. But then people kept asking me this question. What's happening to the children who are being medicated? And what's happening? Why are we seeing so many people on antidepressants and being treated for depression? Why are so many patients being diagnosed with bipolar disorder? So in Anatomy of an Epidemic, I looked at this question, and that's the book we're talking about here. I did first look at the question that what is the narrative that governs our thinking? And that's the chemical imbalance theory. Second of all, once that theory was promoted, what happened in terms of use of psychiatric drugs in the United States? It exploded. So, for example, in 1987, we were spending about $800 million on psychiatric drugs in the United States. By 2007, we were spending $40 billion. And the first thing I looked at is, as we get more people treated, are we seeing the burden of mental illness in the United States, measured, for example, by the number of people on disability, go up or down? Because usually when you get more people treated for a disease, you should see the burden of that illness decrease in a society. Instead, we were seeing a soaring number of people on disability due to psychiatric disorders. So something seemed amiss. And then I took on this question, and this question is really why I think the book has been translated into a number of languages, is I looked at, so drugs get approved because they knock down the symptoms, psychiatric drugs, better than placebo over the short term in studies funded by drug companies over, say, 6 weeks. I wanted to ask this question. how do psychiatric drugs affect people over the long term? What is their impact on the long term? And to answer that question, you really do have to go back through history and you try to identify what is the natural capacity to recover, and is your intervention improving on that natural capacity to recover? So what's key here is you may have many people who are doing fine on medications, but in the aggregate, the question is, are you improving on the natural capacity to recover? And unfortunately, what you find, jumping to the conclusion, is with every class of drugs, on the whole, this does not mean nobody does well on the medications, but you're increasing the chronicity of the disorder over the long term and increasing the likelihood that someone will become functionally impaired. So that's, and you mentioned that I was in the Harvard Library. You have to trace this history, and when you trace this history, you do find moments of oh my God moments where they say, are we making things worse? It goes back to the 1970s, and you see that with antipsychotics and antidepressants. So that's a long-winded answer, but it came about, I had a conventional understanding of the progress we were making, and then I came upon research and evidence that made me want to investigate whether that narrative of progress was true.
Dziękuję. Dobrze. Zgadzam się po części, ale wiadomo, w większej części się nie będę zgadzać. Wytłumaczę zaraz, gdzie się nie zgadzam, gdzie te punkty styczne, gdzie tych punktów stycznych nie ma, a gdzie te punkty styczne z mojej perspektywy są. Znaczy, po pierwsze, Państwo musicie wiedzieć o tym, że system opieki medycznej w Stanach Zjednoczonych jest zupełnie inny niż system opieki medycznej w Polsce. I faktycznie, jeśli miałabym wybierać, gdzie chciałabym się leczyć, wybrałabym Polskę. I ja wiem, że może to dla Was brzmi kontrowersyjnie, bo jesteście w Polsce i na pewno jesteście wielokrotnie zawiedzieni przez system opieki zdrowotnej. Wiem to, ale już Wam wytłumaczę, dlaczego system opieki amerykańskiej jest zdecydowanie gorszy niż ten polski w tym zakresie zdrowia psychicznego, bo to jest bardzo istotne w zakresie zdrowia psychicznego. Zacznę od małego słownika. Mały słownik psychiatryczny. Zaburzenia psychiczne to zbiór bardzo wielu jednostek. To zbiór jednostek, które są jednostkami, po pierwsze, tymi, które są jednostkami, z którymi się rodzimy. Czyli są to zaburzenia neuroróżnorodności różnego typu, neuroatypowe, które pojawiają się wraz z urodzeniem. Drugi, kolejny taki wór zaburzeń, można podzielić zaburzenia na endo- i egzogenne. Endogenne to te, które występują w związku z tym, jak biologicznie, genetycznie zaprogramowany jest nasz organizm. Bo ludzkie ciało jest mega niesamowite. Słuchajcie, a mózg to już jest w ogóle super i rewelacyjny, bo mózg przez cały czas swojej pracy będzie dążył do homeostazy, do równowagi. Po to jest zaprogramowany, żeby wszelkie wstrząsy z zewnątrz równoważyć. I teraz, jeśli nasz organizm pracuje dobrze, co rozumiem przez słowo organizm pracuje dobrze, to nie jest tylko, że synapsy dobrze przenoszą informację medyczną, tylko to jest cały układ powiązany. Nasz organizm działa na zasadzie sprzężeń dodatnych i ujemnych. Jedno oddziaływuje na drugie. Jeżeli w jednym miejscu jest za mało, w drugim miejscu zaczyna być więcej. Przykładem jest oś przysadka podzgórze nadnercza. To jest oś 3 gruczołów endokrynnych, które wydzielają hormony, które regulują pracę absolutnie każdego narządu, nie że tylko głowy. I teraz w momencie, w którym ta oś endokrynna jest zaburzona na jakimś poziomie, wyskoczy Wam zaburzenie na innym poziomie. Niedoczynność tarczycy, choroba Hashimoto autoimmunologiczna, różnego rodzaju problemy z niepłodnością, z innymi chorobami endokrynnymi, hiperkortyzolemia, hiperprolaktynemia. Wszystko są stany, które wynikają z nieprawidłowego poziomu hormonów, które przekładają się na zdrowie psychiczne. I to są te wszystkie choroby, które będą endogenne. Endogenne, czyli bez czynnika zewnętrznego, które będą sterowane przez te wszystkie biologiczne czynniki i przez to, jak biologicznie funkcjonuje nasz organizm. Egzogenne to zbiór zaburzeń i chorób. Niestety w Polsce mamy taką dość trudną sytuację nomenklaturową, czym jest zaburzenie, a czym jest choroba. Nie chciałabym o tym rozmawiać, bo to jest właściwie rozmowa na kolejny panel, bo dlaczego właściwie my mówimy choroby i zaburzenia psychiczne. Ja tylko się odniosę do tego, że w Stanach Zjednoczonych czy na świecie disorder oznacza w Polsce choroba i zaburzenie. Jakby to słowo w Polsce oznacza to samo, a my w Polsce to rozróżniamy i trochę się tam zaplątaliśmy w tym i to powoduje, że teraz ja też się plączę, mówiąc do was, że choroby i zaburzenia psychiczne. I tutaj mamy różnego rodzaju stany, takie jak stany reaktywne, czyli w odpowiedzi na sytuację zewnętrzną nasz organizm reaguje. Jeżeli sytuacja zewnętrzna nas przerasta, nasz organizm, nasz mózg traci zdolności do autoregulacji i niestety nie jest w stanie tej autoregulacji dokonać, więc nie jest w stanie balansować tych wstrząsów z zewnątrz. To prowadzi do różnego rodzaju kryzysów zdrowia psychicznego. Jakich kryzysów zdrowia psychicznego? A to już się komplikuje, bo to już jest kwestia predyspozycji takich, jakie mamy, jakie dziedziczymy, jakie środowisko nam przekazało. W tych zaburzeniach egzogennych mamy uzależnienia, chociaż to jest trudny podział, bo uzależnienia to są chorobami, które są biopsychospołeczne, czyli czynnik biologiczny, psychologiczny i zewnętrzny, środowiskowy. Tu mamy zaburzenia depresyjne, tu mamy zaburzenia lękowe. I to, do czego dąży psychiatria i to, do czego psychiatria powinna dążyć, i staramy się to robić, bo w 1900 roku spotkaliśmy się po raz pierwszy, w sensie ja nie, ale moi koledzy i koleżanki, którzy są psychiatrami i psychiatrkami, spotkali się po raz pierwszy na kongresie, na pierwszym zjeździe psychiatrycznym i wtedy te 120 lat temu ustalili, psychika, mózg jest elastyczny, mózg się zmienia. W związku z tym nie możemy mieć tych samych kryteriów diagnostycznych i przyjmować jednej stałej na całe życie, jeśli chodzi o zaburzenia psychiczne. I mniej więcej ustalili i starają się tego trzymać, że co 10 lat będą zmieniać tą klasyfikację chorób. Dlatego właściwie cały świat posługuje się ICD. Aktualnie mamy 10. Tak, drodzy Państwo, 10. mamy obowiązującą, nie 11, bo nasze państwo i nasze władze nie wprowadziły tłumaczenia ICD-11 w naszym kraju, więc dodatkowo ustawodawstwo nie zostało zmienione, a musi zostać zmienione pod ICD-11, a ICD-11 zostało wprowadzone w styczniu 2 lata temu i niestety, my to takie, wiecie, zaliczymy tu skok cywilizacyjny i my od razu przeskoczymy do ICD-12, no bo nie zdążymy, zobaczycie. To jest tutaj, nie chcę być tym czarną owcą psychiatrii, ale nie zdążymy tego wprowadzić. Nie ma szans. Mieliśmy na to 5 lat, 3 właściwie już straciliśmy, w 2 kolejnych nie uda nam się to zrobić. W Stanach Zjednoczonych posługują się klasyfikacją DSM. Aktualnie tam jest 5. rewizja i one się różnią, te klasyfikacje. I to jest też ta różnica w psychiatrii. My w psychiatrii w Polsce średnia długość pobytu pacjenta psychotycznego, czyli z zaburzeniami psychotycznymi, u nas w szpitalu to jest około 30 dni. To jest taka średnia, gdzieś też jest to związane z NFZ-em, bo NFZ lubi, żeby to było 30 dni i słuchajcie, w 30 dni się szybko trzeba uwinąć, aczkolwiek i tak mamy lepiej niż w Stanach Zjednoczonych, bo tam w Stanach Zjednoczonych właściwie cała psychiatria jest interwencyjna. Tam każdy dzień kosztuje miliony złotych, miliony dolarów, bo złotych, miliony dolarów i tam lekarzom zależy na tym, żeby jak najszybciej zdiagnozować, jak najszybciej podać coś, co pomoże, żeby wygasić tę sytuację i idziemy dalej. Koledzy i koleżanki w Stanach Zjednoczonych myślę, że mają o wiele trudniejszą przez to robotę, dlatego że my mamy czas przyglądać się temu pacjentowi. My mamy czas na to, żeby z nim pobyć i zobaczyć. Nawet jak on jest 30 dni w szpitalu, ja pracowałam 12 lat w szpitalu psychiatrycznym na oddziale ostroprzyjęciowym, te 30 dni było wystarczająco do tego, żeby zobaczyć. Szczególnie, że większość chorób w swoich kategoriach ma to, że no tak jak depresja. Żeby rozpoznać depresję, objawy muszą się utrzymywać 2 tygodnie. Jeżeli mówimy o Stanach Zjednoczonych, gdzie ten czas się skraca do tygodnia, to jak można postawić odpowiednią diagnozę, jeżeli nie można tego kryterium czasu tutaj już sprawdzić do końca i zauważyć? W chorobach psychiatrycznych jest dość podobnie. Czy
Are these realities that are given in the book, can they be translated into Polish reality one-to-one? It's mainly because of the insurance system, health insurance system. When it comes to medications, well, there are different medications. We usually say psychiatric medications, well, psychiatric drugs. What drug would you tell me? Benzodiazepine. So, anti-depression medications, well, antipsychotic. What else? Sedatives, psychotropic. We have a category like that, which covers medications that are used to treat ADHD, or drugs such as opioids. From opioid category. These are also psychiatric drugs. This is a huge category of medications, and whenever you speak about it, well, be precise what types of medications you have in mind. Well, all right. That was a short, a brief presentation of the dictionary that we are using in our mental health. And in the United States, do you still use this? Is it still the case that private insurance, health insurance, is extremely expensive, and the patient also wants to spend as little time as possible when being diagnosed because he has to pay for that? Is that the situation in the United States? Does it look like?
Healthcare system in the United States is a mess. I think you know this. We do not have national health service. In terms of in terms of who's paying for psychiatric drugs, the government pays for something like 60% because in terms of people who are poor and that sort of thing.
Obamacare?
Pardon me?
It's about Obamacare?
Well, sure. We have Obamacare now to sort of fill it. So if you look at our healthcare system, we have private insurance that often comes from employers. We do have insurance, Medicaid and Medicare for either the elderly or the poor. And Obamacare was supposed to fit in the middle of that, the people who were working but weren't getting their insurance through the system. In terms of how, first of all, I don't know how psychiatry is practiced in Poland. I wouldn't try to say that I do, okay? What I do know is how psychiatry and the conceptions arose in the United States. And there was very much an exporting of the ideas from the United States around the world. So, for example, I went to the 2007 conference of the American Psychiatric Association. About half the psychiatrists were from outside the United States. And so there was very much an exporting of the conceptions and ideas that were developed in 1980, really, starting with DSM-3. So that story is like this. In 1980, the American Psychiatric Association published the third edition of its Diagnostic and Statistical Manual. And this was when they adopted what they called a disease model of conceptualizing and treating psychiatric disorders. And if you read a book by Nancy Andreasen, who is the editor-in-chief of the American Journal of Psychiatry, called The Broken Brain, this is how it was presented to the public. We now think, we hypothesize that depression, schizophrenia, anxiety, ADHD are diseases of the brain that are characterized by chemical imbalances in the brain, and where the thought is that we now have drugs that fix those chemical imbalances. And that was the story that was used to promote psychiatry as a discipline that treated medical illnesses, because in the 1970s, there was a lot of a feeling within American psychiatry that they were losing their position in society. There was a lot of anti-psychiatry movements. Psychologists were treating patients as well, and they said, we need to restore our image. And they said the way we can restore our image is put on the proverbial white coat, because the white coat is about doctors that treat infectious diseases. And we need to present ourselves that treat diseases of the brain. And that's what they did with DSM-3. Now, if you read this key book, The Broken Brain, she says, the chemical imbalance story is a hypothesis. We haven't actually found that people with depression have low serotonin, or people with schizophrenia have too much dopamine. And then they spent a long time actually promoting that hypothesis had been proven to the American public. And frankly, I don't know if it was exported to Poland. I sort of imagine that it was. That idea was exported pretty much around the world, that they had found that chemical imbalances were the cause of depression and schizophrenia, et cetera. But if you go into the research, you find that the hypothesis didn't pan out. And in fact, in 1999, the American Psychiatric Association's own textbook said, the low serotonin theory of depression is dead. It didn't pan out. And you can go forward with that. 2004, a man named Kenneth Kendler, who was editor-in-chief of Psychological Medicine, said, we have hunted for big, simple chemical explanations for psychiatric disorders, and we have not found them. And in 2012, a very famous psychiatrist named Ronald Pye said, the chemical imbalance theory of mental disorders is a kind of myth, never a theory seriously propounded by well-informed psychiatrists. So for me as a journalist, this is a problem if the public, so while this is what you find in the research literature, they would do surveys of the American public, and 85% would say, we now know that depression is caused by low serotonin. So you saw this gap between what the public believed and what the research showed. And so that's the first part of this narrative that falls apart. Now, when you're right, we have DSM-4 and DSM-5. DSM-4 was, the head person was a man named Alan Francis, and if he now says, we conceived of these things as diseases of the brain, but we really need to understand that we haven't validated them as real diseases. There's various ways that you can validate diseases, and they should be understood to be constructs. In other words, we're grouping people together by symptoms, but that doesn't really mean that we've identified these as discrete diseases. So one of the things you find in Anatomy of an Epidemic is that it looks at how this story arose, the story of diseases fixed by drugs that fix chemical imbalances in the brain, what the research found, and what, in fact, leading psychiatrists and researchers in the United States are now saying about the DSM, saying that we really don't know if these are diseases of the brain. They're acknowledging that the chemical imbalance theory didn't pan out. And then if you dig further into this, you'll find researchers, well, they're trying to understand why disorders are now running more chronic course. They'll say these drugs are causing they're actually inducing a chemical imbalance in the brain. They're inducing a sort of an abnormal functioning of the brain, and that may be the reason we're seeing this increased chronicity. Now, none of this is ever promoted to the public. But remember, I'm a journalist, and my job is to make the research known. That's what I was trained in for many years. So it is if you read Anatomy of an Epidemic, you'll find a counter-narrative, but it is a counter-narrative that is based in the research by, leading researchers around the world.
Zgadzam się z tym fragmentem dotyczącym teorii serotoninowej i teorii.
Now I'd like to speak to the theory of Maja Herman's serotonin. Now, of course, as the name suggests, it's theory. We have many theories in psychiatry. Now, what's surprising, that there is not, we don't hold such panels about cardiological drugs. Nobody considers cardiological theories. There are some theories there. This is the way science progresses. First, a theory is formed, and then we check it out, and we are trying to find out whether it pans out or not. Same thing about the underlying causes of psychiatric disorders. So what is the consensus? Now we lean towards a biological, psychological model. So both biological and psychological aspects, like the environment we were brought up, whether it's helpful or unhelpful, what kind of habits and coping habits we have, what strategies we were given, as well as the social context of the country we live in. Of course, these can be extremely varied. I talked to a friend about Japan and the geishas yesterday, to a colleague, and they told me that it is actually not perceived as good if a man doesn't have a geisha. Now, think about it. In our culture, what do you think? How would you, what would you think about it if your husband had yet another woman? And that also plays a role in psychiatric disorders. We must not look at a person as an individual only in one dimension. We need to adopt a multi-dimensional view. In terms of medications, speaking about research and how we perceive them, wherever we look, we can find some research proving or disproving a theory. This is the role of science in terms of the safety of drugs. Robert told us that he was interested in the long-term effects of drugs. We have a study about sertraline, long-term effects in men with a burden of coronary incidents like cardiac arrests, things like that. And the life of those patients was extended due to their medications. Now, about 20% of now, if you take antidepressants, if you're happy, then you don't need to take as many medications for blood pressure. This is also visible in terms of obesity. Now, why is it the case that one of the medications for obesity contains an antidepressant? Well, this is because those patients tend to be more compliant, and that helps. Now, there are a number of theories in the beginnings of medicine and how we tend to understand psychiatry. Psychiatry is very, very young, one of the youngest branches of medicine. There's still many, many discoveries ahead of us, and in the future, probably we'll need to revoke many things. For example, Rett disease. The theory was that it was thought to be developmental disease with autism and Asperger's. And now we know that it's rooted in genetics, but there was a theory about, let's say, a cold mother or emotionally indifferent mother who caused schizophrenia or Rett's disease in the children. So those were theories. So when you hear the word theory, you must not accept it for a fact. There have been many of such theories in Freud's times. One of my favorites, it's ironical here, we knew that there was one type of breast cancer. The that was the knowledge. Okay, if somebody has a breast cancer, that was it. Now today, after this technological advancement, as molecular medicine advanced so much, we know that there are at least 40 types of different of breast cancer. Same thing is going to happen with psychiatry. Whatever we accept as a sure thing will turn out to be different. We cannot think about what is today in light of what was in the past. What was in the past is supposed to be material for us to grow, to develop even more finer theories. Now, in your book, you say that the increase in prescriptions, I don't know exactly which medications, prescriptions for which medications, leads to higher rates of disorders. This is my understanding. Please correct me if I got it wrong. Now, you say that this increase is because the medications actually damage the central nervous system. And the question is, first of all, am I correct in understanding this, that an increase in the medications prescribed increases the rate or the scale of psychiatric disorders? For example, it's not always the case. For example, psychotic disorders have not grown, as bipolar has not grown. Psychotics is 1%. Again, in Freud's times, there were no people addicted to computer games, for instance, different situations. Today we have very many behavioral addictions, but for example, addiction to alcohol remains stable. So there is a certain pool of the same disorders that
Życia, skok technologiczny jest zdecydowanie za duży w stosunku do tego, co nasz mózg jest w stanie skompensować i jak nasz mózg jest w stanie sobie poradzić z mnogością bodźców. I takie, jak dla mnie, takie jest to zbyt duże uproszczenie mówiące o tym, że wzrost przepisywania leków przeciwdepresyjnych powoduje wzrost tych zaburzeń. Chciałam cię skonfrontować z tym.
So what she's talking about is not exactly an increased number of disorders, but an increased number on government disability due to a psychiatric disorder. And what you find, first of all, in the United States is we went from 1.2 million adults on disability in 1987 to over 4 million adults on disability in 2007 during this time of rapid increased use of psychiatric drugs and the rapid expansion of people who get a diagnosis. And it is not coming from people with psychotic disorders, it's coming from people with mood disorders. That's what's causing the increase. And so, for example, we went from about 440,000 people disabled by mood disorders in 1987 to more than 2 million in 2007. And when I first reported on this, people said, oh, that's because of your healthcare system. United States sucks. It's just happening in the United States. And so I was asked by a work group in the Parliament of the United Kingdom to present on this question. And so I looked at in other countries, were you seeing as antidepressant usage rose, did you see an increase in disability due to mood disorders? And disability as measured by people seen as unable to work. And it was happening in every country, okay? Now that's just a correlation. But now you want to look at the research that looks at how do people fare when they stay on antidepressants for a long term. And what you find quite clearly, at least in research done in the English-speaking world, is that on the whole, there are two problems with antidepressants. They increase the likelihood, and I can talk about the research findings that showed this, antidepressants long-term increase the likelihood that people will remain symptomatic. That's one problem. We also did a study that, there's been a couple studies looking at functional impairment related to antidepressant use compared to people with a similar severity of depression at the beginning and looking at who went on disability, and the rate was 7 times higher for those who took antidepressants over a 6-year period. The second part is you said you haven't had an increase in bipolar disorder, I think, here. In the United States, we did. We had a huge increase in bipolar disorder once the SSRI antidepressants were introduced. It went up something like 70% within a decade. In terms of juvenile bipolar disorder, it went up 40-fold in 10 years. And it is well known within circles of mood experts within American psychiatry that antidepressants can stir a manic episode in people who were initially diagnosed with unipolar depression. Then they get a diagnosis of bipolar depression, and that's a much more severe category of disorder. And Yale University looked at 88,000 patients who were initially diagnosed with unipolar depression, and then they looked at people who were treated with an antidepressant and those who avoided treatment with the antidepressant, and they found that the conversion to bipolar was twice as high for those who received an antidepressant. So that is data that shows why, if you have widespread use of antidepressants, you're going to, it becomes a causal explanation for why, for why you're seeing this increase in disability. And so what you have to do, at least as a journalist, is sort of try to put all this information together. It's like putting together pieces of a puzzle. And so you start with the public health data. Thanks for the glass of water. You start with the public health data that shows that public health outcomes are worsening for mood disorders. And then you look at research of every type you can find and see what do they say about the difference between people who take medications long-term being the key here, versus those who do not. And then you try to put together a puzzle. Now, again, I want to say one thing. I'm talking about a perspective that does arise within the United States. So much of this research is done by the United States or in other English-speaking countries. So, for example, the story is very similar in the UK, Australia, etc. So that is the story that I'm reporting on and research from there. However, I do have to say, I've traveled a lot. I've traveled to the Scandinavian countries, throughout South America, and this story was more or less exported to many countries around the world.
Powiedz mi,
And tell me the main thought that you'd like to leave us with, the message, well, or maybe after the questions. Well, just one sentence as a home take message about the book and about what you'd like people to stay with. I don't want to leave people with their fears, because I think that we've started discussing whether drinking tea excludes drinking coffee. I think you can drink one and the other. You should look at things from different angles, and nobody says that medications don't have negative consequences, because there are negative consequences of medications. We have to research that, and we don't have to. We cannot be afraid of investigating these negative effects of medications, and we cannot leave that aside. Well, psychiatry and our meeting today also may have some unexpected or unwanted consequences resulting from our cognitive hunger and satisfaction of our cognitive hunger. Would you like to?
Sure, real quickly. One, some people do benefit from the medications. Great. I wish everybody benefited from the medications. And so don't use this as anything that it should be indicative of what you should do on an individual level. But the message is this, is that we have organized ourselves, at least in English-speaking countries, but I think it is happening in many, many countries, around a false narrative of science, a narrative that said we've discovered these are discrete diseases, and we have drugs that fix the underlying pathology, like insulin for diabetes, and that led to a great expansion. And yet when you see the research, when you follow the research, you just find that that narrative is not, it's countered by what you find in the scientific literature. So the message is that I think we need a new narrative to govern our thinking around psychiatric disorders. And I think actually if you have a new narrative, if you look into the research, there's all sorts of research that actually tells human beings are very resilient. They can have difficult times, but often these difficult times are episodic. And there's many ways that if you find different environments, for example, you spoke about the importance of environment. People's difficulties, they abate, they lessen. So oddly enough, I think this story is an optimistic one because rather than seeing a disorder as something wrong with your brain that is persistent, it so often tells you that things happen for a time and they are responsive to environment. We often have an extraordinary inner strength to get back and get well. So the message is, I think we've organized ourselves around a false narrative of science, and we do want to organize our care and our thinking around what we do know about science. You mentioned that it's a very young science. There is so much unknown about the brain, and we should stop pretending we know that this molecule causes this or that molecule causes that. So just final message is, this is not meant to be like what you should do with your prescriptions and think about yourselves. It's about how we as a society think about psychiatric disorders, what we know about them, and if it's of interest to you, what research is showing that in the aggregate, what long-term usage of these medications, what outcomes they achieve.
Mamy 6 minut i 50.
We have 6 minutes, 50 seconds. Who'd like to ask a question? Yes, there is a mic. I have a comment, a brief comment. Well, I read your book and I loved it. I also read it in conjunction with Lieberman's publication, the biography of schizophrenia. Well, it gives a perspective on biopsychiatry. I'm afraid that this biopsychiatric model has not been really embraced in Poland, but we have a different culture of work. Environmental psychiatric is feeling quite well in Poland. So we probably have a different perspective, but our psychiatrists, very good psychiatrists, are very careful about prescribing medications. When I was reading your book, I thought, oh my God, it's good that they don't prescribe as many medications as they do in the United States, and I think that this. If the model adopted very well, that we wouldn't need this biosocial model adopted very well in Poland, we probably wouldn't need psychiatrists. Well, psychiatrists are needed. No, they will be needed. Well, I must, we were one specialization, neurology and psychiatrist. Freud was a neurologist, let's remember that. This is a brief comment, and my question is, because in your book you mention an adoption of an open dialogue, an approach of an open dialogue. Do you think, while looking at different trends across the world, do you think that this approach will become increasingly more popular? In Poland, it's becoming popular, especially when it comes to minor patients, but can it be popular all over the world? I know that in Japan, they have some problems about it, but is it, can these open approaches be disseminated?
Thinking about open dialogue practices that were developed in northern Finland going back to the 1990s. And they achieved much better outcomes over the long term for their psychotic patients, incredibly different outcomes. The importance of open dialogue is this, and it is being sort of exported around the world. And one of the things I just want to say is, if we go forward, one of the thoughts is, can we learn from others that are doing things successfully? So in this book, I wrote about open dialogue because they had research that showed after 5 years of their newly psychotic patients, 80% are working or back in school and asymptomatic, which is a really good outcome for psychotic patients. Now, what do they do in terms of antipsychotics, at least as it was in northern Finland? They do not give their patients, when they were doing this research, antipsychotics right away. They try to wait for a time to see if a person can begin to, they call it a grip on life, if their grip on life can improve without the use of antipsychotics. And the thought is, if they're not using antipsychotics, they can bring more emotional resources to their recovery, so to speak. But what's nice about open dialogue, it's not an anti-medication model, it's a best use model. So they find that patients end up in 3 groups. One group can get better with never going on the medication. This is newly psychotic patients. And after 5 years, when they were doing this care in northern Finland, 67% of their first episode patients never needed to go on antipsychotics. Now, they're getting all sorts of intensive psychotherapy and called dialogical therapy, where they try to give people a sense of breaking their isolation, a memory of when they could be with others and could accomplish things, and then they try to build a narrative going forward of hope and what do you want in life, and they build bridges back to work and school. Now, a second group, about 13%, needed the medications for a time and could still come off, and then be without the medications long term. And then they found that about 20% need to be on the medications long term. So it's a best use model for whom and for how long. Now, one of the problems, I do know some people that are involved in trying to get it, have been introducing it to Poland. But one of the problems is as it gets introduced and exported, they're not adopting that selective use model. They're just really focusing on the dialogical therapy. And if you go to the people in northern Finland, as I did, they think that selective use model was key to their good 5-year outcomes. But the problem is so often when it gets exported, say, to the United States, it is seen as malpractice not to immediately medicate people. But that's an example, I'm really glad you brought this up, is we should learn from other places, other programs, and try to incorporate it into our own thinking about what we can do, say, in the United States or other countries.
Ja tylko dodam a propos
I'd like to add about open dialogue and research on that. Well, the current studies that we have are studies, well, these are case reports and quantitative studies. We lack randomized studies. We lack these research that is at the top of the hierarchy. That's probably one of the reasons why we haven't embraced this model so enthusiastically, because despite this, although these case reports, we have these case reports and quantitative research, but that's not all that we need. Joanna Gutral, good morning. As a psychotherapist and a fan of evidence-based practice methods, I loved your book, and it wasn't controversial to me. It didn't go against anything that I think of psychiatrics. But I'm just thinking whether by discussing psychiatry we want to open the already open door. We know that many disorders are of psychosocial nature. In a normal model, if we had the ability to respond immediately with the environment, to change the environment, if we had a well-performing system of psychiatric or mental health care, we could prevent the limitations or exclusion of certain methods. Well, Maja, you are a doctor. Tell me about a recommendation where with psychiatric medications are not accompanied by therapy or environmental treatment. Well, we have therapeutic outcomes that for which pharmacotherapy is the only response for the patient not to become a threat to herself or himself or their immediate environment. Well, we don't have a law on psychotherapy, psychotherapists, and I think that we should take care about the efficiency and patient safety. Thank you very much for your book and for coming to Poland.
Tak, myślę, że to było podsumowanie.
It was a kind of summary or conclusion. Joanna is a psychotherapist and she is my inspiration in many aspects. Thank you, Joanna, for coming here. I also feel a little bit nervous. I'm stressed when she's around, but our type is up. I encourage you to ask questions directly to Robert. I'm sure we'll be here for a while with you. What I'd like as a message from me, well, we have two legs. A human being has two legs. Well, having one leg is not always safe. So using two legs is a very simple comparison. To breathe, we need oxygen and CO2. And it's not the case that in any other area, one factor solves all the problems. One pill will not heal you. Well, taking one pill will not heal you completely. Not taking one pill will not heal you completely either. Most disorders of diseases are chronic and they last long, and you need a lot of patience. It takes a lot of patience, and you need to start listening to us when we say, well, let's don't use psychoactive medications. We take care of our of sleeping well, good diet, good relations with people. Believe me, that can do miracles. Thank you very much, and thank you for being part of this panel.
I just want to say thank you all for coming. My opinion is that societal discussions like this are so important to what we should do as a society to help each other stay well and healthy. So thank you. It's a pleasure and an honor to be here with you today.
Jedzą kanapki z kawiorem.
Nadzwyczajna kasa.
Obrażanie dziennikarzy telewizji polskiej.
Chodzi o działania polityczne.
Przygotowanie ofiar dla pedofilów.
Für Deutschland.
TVP Info. Włącz się na nowo.
Zapraszamy do Trójki. Od nowa.
Trójka. Program Trzeci Polskiego Radia.
Polskie Radio.
Jedynka.
Rodzina spółek Pelion to 12 000 osób pracujących w ponad 300 spółkach w Polsce, Szwecji, Wielkiej Brytanii i na Litwie. Jesteśmy liderem w branży ochrony zdrowia. Od 1990 roku dbamy o długość i jakość życia. Pracować z nami możesz w jednym z 7 obszarów.
Czy wytrzymasz klockowe tortury? Ze stoickim spokojem. Czy w twardych negocjacjach zachowasz zimną krew? Czy poddasz się dobrowolnej eksmisji ze swojego łóżka? Brawo! Test na obecność serca zaliczony. To znaczy, że ty też możesz być rodzicem zastępczym. Dowiedz się jak na testserca.pl.
Plany biznesowe powstają z marzeń. Dlatego nie ma dwóch takich samych firm. Jedni chcą działać na całym świecie. Innym cały świat mieści się w dłoni. Sukces biznesu to nie tylko jego wielkość, ale też szczęście, jakie przynosi ludziom. PKO Bank Polski.
Uwielbiam szycie w sieci. Wczoraj podszyłem się pod wnuczka, wieczorem uszyłem intrygę na apce randkowej, a dziś planuję grubymi nićmi szyte oszustwo z promocją. Tak się szyje.
Na oszustów są sposoby. Zapoznaj się z poradami ekspertów na niedajsiepodszyć.pl.
Radość, nadzieja, życie, wyzwanie, pasja, pamięć, zaufanie, pokój, jedność. Słowa tworzą świat. Polskie Radio. Źródło wiarygodnych informacji.
It's not always easy to recognize. It may look like this, or like this. It may be a burden, but it is a responsibility that we embrace nonetheless. But if it means this for one person and this for someone else, maybe it ultimately means being there for one another. It isn't handed to us, but we know where to find it and how it feels, how it tastes, and what it sounds like when we finally have it. It means different things to different people, but for many, it means everything. And if we all fight for it, it will eventually bring us together.